Carl Dietrich is the CEO and founder of Terrafugia, a flying car. And as he tells me, the flying car has been around as a concept since 1917, which is really quite extraordinary unto itself. But of course, the Jetsons, James Bond, and its legend has lived on. Here we meet tonight an entrepreneur who's bringing to market a real flying car that he believes has a future. So as I said, Carl had an interest in flying at age 8. He received his full-fledged pilot's license at age 17, and by age 30 he was on his way to founding an aircraft manufacturer here in the U.S. He's an West Coast native, the East Bay, San Francisco area. I've got a daughter out there. I love to see those folks come east instead of our folks going west. So that's a great pleasure. He came to MIT in 1995, and he said he fell in love and never left. He completed his BS, his MS, and his PhD in aeronautics and astro. You have to help me with that, Carl. Is it astronautics? Astronautics, thank you. So please welcome me in joining an extraordinary speaker, and welcome me in welcoming Carl Dietrich.
Terrafugia is developing the first practical flying car. We call it the Transition Street Legal Airplane. It's a two-person vehicle that can fold up its wings in about 40 seconds, drive down the road legally at highway speeds, and park in a single-car garage. It runs on normal premium unleaded gasoline, so you just drive it into a normal gas station just like you drive your car in and you fill it up. It gets comparable gas mileage or better gas mileage to most cars on the road, and it flies like a normal light airplane and it drives like a normal car. So it will be very familiar to both pilots and drivers out there. Terrafugia is also working on a military contract, the DARPA TX program, which is very nice to have some revenue coming in the door while we're still in the development stage on the transition program. We're a subcontractor to AAI, which is part of Textron Systems. So that's bringing some nice revenue in the door for Terrafugia today. But our primary focus is and always has been the development of the transition. There are only about 600,000 pilots in the United States today, but if you ask them what their biggest problems are, this is what they'll tell you. If you fly light aircraft, one of the biggest headaches that you have is weather sensitivity. Little airplanes are fundamentally very weather sensitive. So you fly somewhere, the weather changes on you, and you can be stuck. You might have to rent a car to get where you need to be and then drive back to pick up your plane at a later time. It's very inconvenient to have to change your plans at the last minute. With a flying driving vehicle, you have the flexibility of choosing which mode of transportation you want to use. So if the weather changes on you, you simply drive where you want to go. Owning and operating an aircraft is a very expensive proposition. You typically want to keep your major investment protected in the winter, so you'll rent a hangar for it. Hangar at the nearest airport to here, which is Hanscom, can run in excess of $1,000 a month. It's like having another apartment. It's not exactly for the budget flyer. And consequently, most pilots like myself will rent when we want to fly, which also is a bit inconvenient because we have to work around everybody else's schedule. In addition, most aircraft that are flying today run on 100 low-lead aviation fuel, which actually is gasoline that still has some lead in it, which not only is not particularly good for the environment, but it's also over $6 a gallon right now. So you're paying quite a significant premium, and most airplanes burn more gas than your car does. With the transition, you get comparable gas mileage to your car. You run on basically the same gas that you run your car on. And with the wings folded up, you can drive down the road and keep your plane at home in your garage. So you don't have to rent a hangar for the aircraft. So your daily operating costs, the recurring costs of ownership, the one that you feel in your wallet all the time, that's significantly reduced compared to other aircraft out there. The next biggest problem that pilots have identified is the limited mobility. It turns out there's a network of over 5,000 public use airports around the United States. There's one on average within a half-hour drive of wherever you are in this country. Most people don't know that those airports exist, but they're out there. They're our nation's largest underutilized transportation resource. Most of those airports, because they're not frequently trafficked, don't have the market to demand Hertz or Avis to set up a rental car counter. In fact, most of them don't even have a cab stand. So you get there, and if you're lucky, the FBO will have a courtesy car that you may be able to borrow if the pilot who landed before you didn't already borrow it. But generally speaking, it's hard to count on. So you get to an airport, and you call up a cab and wait 20 minutes for it to show up. That's a pretty big inconvenience. With the transition, that's not a problem. It takes 40 seconds to fold up the wing, you drive out the gate, and you're on your way. You couldn't get to a cab faster than you can get on the road in a transition. The long door-to-door travel time of general aviation today is identified as the last major problem pilots face. And that has to do with the overhead that's associated with transitioning between flying and driving. And we experience this as commercial flyers a lot. You got to get to the airport an hour in advance. Well, general aviation pilots don't have to do that, but they do have to plan their own flight. Generally, you can't do that on the road in your car. In the transition, you can. Once you get to the airport, you have to push your plane out. Usually you have to call up the fuel guy, wait for him to come over and fill up your plane. You got to move your bags, you've got to reload, you've got to repack, do your weight and balance, all that sort of thing. And then finally be on your way. On average, pilots spend between a half hour and 45 minutes on the ground stopped on either end of your trip. When you tack on that hour to an hour and a half to a given door-to-door trip, that's a pretty substantial time penalty. And it makes flying by general aviation aircraft today pretty impractical for a large range of trips that otherwise would be quite practical if you weren't stopped on the ground for that long a period of time. With the transition, with a 40-second conversion between flying and driving modes, and a simple 5 to 10 minute pre-flight inspection, you can be on your way. So the transition is the only product on the market that directly addresses all of the statistically identified largest obstacles to the more widespread use of personal aviation. And we've contracted with some outside companies to do some market research, and they don't want to over-project here, but they say conservatively we're expecting to capture over 10% of the existing market and inspire fundamental growth outside of the existing pilot base today. And that's something that is very exciting for us. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. General aviation industry sort of hit its heyday back in the post-war era. You could reasonably say that the general aviation industry is an old industry. It's not Web 2.0. It's not biotech. This is kind of people have been flying airplanes for a long time. In fact, if you look, this chart here is the history of the general aviation market in terms of the number of units per year that the industry delivered. Coming off the end of World War II, the industry delivered 35,000 units, and it's never achieved that rate of production since then. The market was saturated with all the manufacturing capacity that we had coming off the end of the war, and the industry crashed to pretty much about the level that we are right now in the early 1950s, and then gradually built back up through the 60s and into the late 70s with a dip in there for the oil embargo, and then crashed again in the early 80s. And the issue in the early 80s was product liability. You had aircraft that had been flying for 30, 40, 50 years even that would crash, and then someone would sue the manufacturer. Even though that aircraft had been undergoing annual inspections for 30, 40 years, and very little of that original design of the aircraft affected the failure in flight. Doesn't matter. The companies in the industry were starting to get sued. The big companies decided that it was no longer worthwhile for them to deliver little airplanes. And consequently, almost the entire industry went out of business by the early 90s. It wasn't until 1994 when Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act, which limited manufacturers' liability to 18 years after the date of production of the aircraft, that we started to see some real growth. In fact, even though the numbers are small, if you just looked at the time between 94 and before the economic downturn hit in 2007, the industry billings were growing at about 17% compound annual growth. So we were seeing a bit of a recovery there. And then the downturn hit, and our industry was hit pretty hard. But it's an industry that has incredible potential to be actually useful if we could address those big problems that we identified. So when 2004 came along and the FAA created a significant rule, a new rule, that created a new type of pilot's license, which takes half the time and half the money to get, an entry-level pilot certificate, which actually allows you to use an airplane to go somewhere, and simultaneously reduce the barriers to entry for new potential products, streamlining the certification process. That opened up a tremendous window of opportunity for new companies to bring products to market, and that was actually the catalyst that got myself and the other co-founders of Terrafugia seriously thinking about bringing a new product to the general aviation industry. It wasn't really something that was attractive to us in terms of potential return on investment before then. Certification traditionally would take $50 to $100 million, 5 to 7 years, and for that you would be capturing, in 2007 dollars, about a fraction of a $1 billion marketplace for single-engine piston-powered aircraft. Not a very attractive investment opportunity. With this new rule change, the capital requirements to bring a new product were reduced to 1/5 what they were before this rule. The barriers to entry for new potential customers were cut in half. That's a very significant thing, and if we can bring a product to that marketplace that addresses some of those fundamental problems out there that nobody else is touching, because frankly it's almost cliche to work on a flying car, we have the real potential to do something significant and have a significant impact on this industry. It was a rule change more than the advent of new technology that caused Terrafugia to incorporate. So we started exploring the business opportunity while we were still finishing up. I was still finishing up my PhD program at MIT. We had a couple of hypotheses. First, that a rotatable aircraft, a flying driving vehicle, could directly address these obstacles to the more widespread use of general aviation. And then the second one being that the Sport Pilot Light Sport Aircraft rule, this new rule change that the FAA had come out with, actually creates the conditions where such an investment could yield an attractive return. And in the process of doing this business plan, we researched, and there had been literally over 100 published concepts for flying driving vehicles out there in the past century. And the closest that anybody ever came prior to Terrafugia was a company called the Aerocar Company, which was founded by a gentleman by the name of Molt Taylor in 1949. And at one point in 1968, he had a deal with a manufacturing company. They were going to tool up to produce 1,000 units per year. He just had to get deposits for 500 aircraft. Well, he got deposits for 256, and he used those deposits to fund some of his marketing efforts. And the deal fell through, and shortly after then, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards came into being. And while his design had been certified by the CAA, the precursor to the FAA, it was not able to meet the new motor vehicle safety standards. And consequently, it was not possible for his then certified design to be brought to the marketplace legally. So that was the closest that we ever came to having a flying driving vehicle. Molt Taylor's Aerocar, depending upon who you talked to and how many people were gawking at the time when you tried to convert between flying and driving, would take between 5 minutes with 2 people and nobody looking at you or asking you questions to about 20 minutes with 1 person and people asking questions sporadically to convert between flying and driving modes. If it takes you 20 minutes, there's really no time savings between moving bags between flying and driving vehicles. So we knew that we had to reduce that time. So we knew that making something that converted automatically between flying and driving, where you could be talking to somebody and all I'm doing is holding down these 2 buttons and the plane is converting itself, that was a key to making the concept viable. So we started meeting with the FAA and we said, we know this isn't what you had in mind when you came out with these new regulations. if we start going down this path, is this something that you're likely to shoot down? And they were very open and willing to talk with us about the idea of bringing this sort of thing to market. And they said, well, there's nothing in the regulations that would expressly prohibit this sort of technology. So that was enough for us at the time to get the concept going and get off the ground, and did some wind tunnel testing at MIT, and then submitted our business plan to the MIT 100K business plan competition back in 2006, and we were the runners-up, competing against 164 other business plans that year. That came with a $10,000 check, and that year I also won the Lemelson MIT Student Prize for innovation, and that came with a $30,000 check. So we took the $40,000 there that we got there, we incorporated the company. We looked at the fundamental economics of the situation. We looked at, okay, what's really going to drive decisions in the long run? And working with our associates at MIT, we put together a pretty complex model for evaluating the most economical transportation option, given how much you value your time and how far you need to go. And you can see that for low time values, either you're going to drive or you're going to fly commercially no matter what. And that's not going to change. But if your time value breaks a certain threshold, general aviation starts becoming practical for certain ranges of travel. And if your time value is high enough, then you get into the range where light jets are very useful for a larger range of travel. And there was a lot of interest in the sort of light jet concept early on. Actually, when we were doing this business plan, that was a lot of the early interest. What we said is, well, what if we could push down that barrier to entry and lower that threshold in terms of the dollars per hour? What we found was, with a concept like the transition, there are some things that we can't change. We can't make it the everyman's flying car yet, but we can significantly reduce that barrier to entry to make it more practical for a larger segment of the population. And we can take over a significant fraction of both the automotive market for longer range travel and the GA market. And we're not making a huge penetration on airlines, so we're not taking any business from the big air carriers or anything like that. But for certain high net worth individuals, independent business owners that do $250,000 to $1 million a year of business and do a lot of regional business inside a 500-mile radius, the transition actually could help their business. And that's something that fundamentally, in the long run, we see as a very exciting opportunity, because we see a lot more of those sort of independent business owners that want to have that control over their schedule, where, when they travel, how they get there. With the transition, we give you more flexibility than any other mode of transportation, period. And that's something that's very exciting, has a lot of value. So after we built up a pretty significant order backlog, we started asking people, why is it that you want one of these things? Is it just because it's cool? Is it James Bond appeal? Is it just, I got to have one for my collection? And we found that it really was those four basic problems that were the real drivers. The weather sensitivity of general aviation, not having to pay tie-down fees to be able to fly long distances and know that you can drive back if the weather is no good. The versatility, the novelty, the practicality, the flexibility. Those are the real selling points for this sort of thing. The words that kept coming up were freedom, flexibility, and fun. So fun is definitely in there. It's a definite factor in the marketing of this. But we've got people that are seriously thinking about this for their personal business trips. If they do business inside that sort of 500-mile radius. And actually the backlog is up a bit. We're up around 30 million now. We're also inspiring non-pilots to go out and learn about flying. And that's something that's very exciting. It's very important for the health of the general aviation industry. Mark actually was a non-pilot. He saw a news story about Terrafugia about a year and a half ago, and started digging into it and wondering if this was actually for real. He went onto our website, gave the company a call, arranged to come down and visit us, and by the end of his visit, he had put down a deposit and bought out our company store, I think. And about 9 months later, he sent me the picture over here on the right. That's Mark holding up his new sport pilot certificate. So we're actively converting non-pilots into pilots. And that's something that has huge potential that our market researchers can't quantify accurately, at least not something that they're willing to put their name down on. But it's really exciting for us because our business plan works even if we don't have any growth in the GA industry. But with this, there's some nice upside